What's up guys, I'm here with the odds, outs and combos tab from the pokerweasel.com calculator sheet. Let's start in the top left. We have odds and outs. This tells us how often we're going to hit a certain type of holding, either going from flop to turn or turn to river or from flop to river. Let's see a very quick example where we hold a flush draw. So in this hand we have king 7 of hearts. We defend in the big blind against a small blind open. The board texture comes down ace jack 8. And our opponent fires a continuation bet. So one of our first questions might be, well, how often are we going to hit our flush going from the flop to the turn? So we can choose flop to turn, the type of draw we have, which is a flush draw. We can choose whether or not we have a backdoor flush draw. Now you're going to have to use some intelligence here. This may or may not apply depending on the situation. So here it doesn't apply because we're interested in our direct flush draw. So we're going to choose no for that. And then it gives us a calculation. It tells us we have 9 outs to hit. The odds, if you like to use the ratio format, 4.2 to 1. And then the, in my opinion, more usable frequency value is 19.1%. So this is how often we're going to hit on the next street, 19.1% of the time. If we instead held a gut shot, you can see we'd hit 8.5% of the time. But if we factored in a possible backdoor flush, you can see that we'll hit 10.6% of the time by the river. That's either our gut shot or our runner-runner flush. Based on this, we can decide whether or not we have a correct call based on our implied odds. Let's start filling out the values and we'll see the relevance of this. So percentage chance of hitting on the next street only. Well, we've just calculated that. It's 19.1%. We're going to pick up our flush draw on the next street. We then have two other values. Current pot size after villain's bet or raise, and amount needed to call. So let's see if we can source those values. So the current pot size after villain's bet is 9 big blinds, and we have to call 3 big blinds. So let's fill those out. Current pot size after villain's bet, 9 big blinds, amount needed to call 3 big blinds. This means we're investing 25% of the total pot on our call. And it means that we need to be able to make 3.71 big blinds on the later streets in order for this to be a plus EV defend. So if you think about this, the direct price we're getting is 25%, but we're not going to hit 25%. We're only going to hit 19.1% of the time. What that means is we don't get the direct pot odds to call in this situation. But it's still going to be a plus EV call due to implied odds, because we only need to make 3.71 big blinds on the later streets in order for this to be a plus EV defend. That seems extremely viable given that we have over 90 big blinds left in play for the later streets. So this is definitely going to be a defend in this case. On the turn, we face the second barrel. So we know it was plus EV on the flop. What about the turn? Is it still going to be plus EV? How many additional chips are we going to need to make on the river in order for this to be a correct defend? Well, let's go back to the beginning. So, first of all, the situation's changed slightly. You might think big deal, there's still one card to come, it should be the same, right? And it is roughly the same, but not entirely. If we change this from turn to river, you can see that our chance of hitting actually goes up slightly. Now, why is that the case? Because there's now one less card in the deck that's not going to give us our flush. So we actually have a slightly higher chance of hitting going from turn to river. But there's something else that's slightly different about the spot. Perhaps you noticed that we picked up the gut shot in the situation as well. In fact, not only did we pick up the gut shot, we actually picked up a double gutter here. Because any queen gives us a straight, but also the 9 gives us a straight as well. Admittedly, not a very good straight. And what we can do in situations like this is decide which of our outs that we're going to count. So let's call this a flush draw plus gut shot. If you wanted to count all of our outs, you might call it flush draw plus OEST. But given that the 9 out is tainted because we make the lower end of the straight, let's just call this flush draw plus gut shot. We've got an option here for that. You can see we're going to hit 26.1% of the time by the river in this case. So let's input 26.1%. We once again have to input our values. So current pot size is 18 big blinds in the pot. Amount needed on the call is 6 big blinds. And look at that, we're getting a negative value for required average profits for later streets. So what does that mean exactly? Well, it means that we're actually getting the correct direct price to make the call. We don't need to rely on our implied odds here because we have 26.1% equity and we're only investing 25% of the total pot. This means it's going to be plus EV due to direct pot odds. Now we can confirm this with required equity to call. If we input here our opponent's 50% pot sizing, and let's input the pot size, which is not too important in this situation. It doesn't really change too much. 12 big blinds before our opponent's bet. And you can see required equity 25%. And we have 26.1% equity. So we can see that it's going to be a direct call based on our pot odds. Now we did get a bit lucky on this turn because we picked up the combo draw. We picked up the gut shot as well. What would happen if we still had the naked flush draw but we didn't pick up the gut shot as well? We'd be using this 19.6% value. So let's enter 19.6 here instead, and then see how much we need to make on the later streets. 6.61. Once again, very reasonable to have an easy call in this situation. As a rough guide, it's reasonable to think that we might be able to make up to half of our opponent's remaining stack on average if we have a draw that's not dominated. This doesn't apply if you have a very weak flush draw on a paired turn, for example. You want to be very careful in those spots. You probably don't have any implied odds. But in situations like this, we could probably make half of the effective remaining stacks on average, assuming our opponent might pay us out some of the time rather than just always fold if we hit, that kind of thing. So 6.61 BB, that's going to be very easy to make. We don't get the direct pot odds, but we clearly have a profitable call due to implied odds in this situation. Moving on to the overcards calculator, it tells us how likely it is that there is going to be an overcard on the board. Now, what constitutes an overcard depends on how many possible overcards there are, so we can specify a number here. So let's imagine we have pocket kings on the flop, and we want to know how often the turn is going to be an ace. That's only one overcard in the deck. You can see it's about 8.51% of the time. If you're familiar with the 2 times and 4 times rule, that makes sense because there's going to be 4 aces in the deck. It's going to hit about 8% of the time on the next street. Let's say we were pre-flop with something like pocket tens. So going from pre-flop to the flop, we want to know how often there's going to be a jack or higher on the flop. That's 4 possible overcards. So that means there's actually going to be an overcard most of the time when we have a holding like pocket tens. What about something like kings? How often is there going to be an ace on the flop when we hold kings? We can see 22.55% of the time. That's just going from pre-flop to flop, however. What about pre-flop to river? You'll see it now goes up to 35% of the time. So what that means is pocket kings, you will still have the highest possible pair, 65% of the time or so by the river, but a good 35% of the time that ace is going to be out there by the river when we hold pocket kings. We then have the combo counter. It's just some very basic arithmetic here to figure out how many combos someone might be holding in total. So we know that of pocket pairs, there's 6 combos of each, there's 4 combos of each suited hand, and there's 12 combos of each offsuit hand. So if we were to just put one offsuit combo in, we'd see that there are 12 arrangements of that. If we wanted all combos of ace-king, for example, that would be 1 offsuit combo and 1 suited combo. That's going to end up at 16. Wanted to know how many combos is queens plus? Well, that's queens, kings, and aces. So there's going to be 3 pocket pairs. We can see 18. So 6 times 3 is 18. Finally, we have the required equity preflop. This was also on the EV calculations tab. This can be used to figure out how often a bluff needs to work preflop. It could also technically be used to figure out what price we get on a call. But honestly, pre-flop pot odds are not very important in this game. It's far more important the playability of a hand post-flop. Because remember, we're often just investing a couple of big blinds pre-flop, but then we're proceeding to play with that hand with potentially 100 big blinds at risk post-flop. So in most cases, it makes sense to use this as a full equity calculator. So simple example, our opponent open raises the small blind to 3 big blinds. We're in the big blind and we decide to 3-bet to 9 big blinds, which means we're investing 8 because we already posted the big blind. How much can we win in that situation? Well, we have our opponent's 3 big blinds, he's open raised. We have our 1 big blind, which is now part of the pot. So how often does this need to work? 66.7% of the time. If it works more than that, we can 3-bet profitably with any 2 cards. We have this rake option here as well. If we turn this on, it means we're assuming there's going to be roughly 5% rake deducted from the total pot. So this, in effect, drives up that auto profit threshold. We actually need it to work slightly more often now, given that the pot's going to be raked 5% every time. Of course, if it's a pre-flop situation, it might be that there's no rake taken here, so you would just not include the rake in this case. There are actually more and more networks which are raking pre-flop action, so in which case you'd actually want this turned on. Alright, thanks for watching this odds, outs and combos tutorial. Remember, you can pick up your copy of the PokerWeasel calculator sheet at www.pokerweasel.com.